Hello everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 11th, and we will hear the presentation, a new tool for tracking home and rental values in TODs. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number that's in bold there. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those again in the questions box located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2017. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we ask that you reach out to them and tell them to join us. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division of APA, and you can learn about the Transportation Planning Division and all our divisions at planning.org/divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts for the rest of August. To register for these webcasts, just visit our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And just to let you know, every Friday that we have available for the rest of the year is filled. We're just in the process of getting all the information together to submit for CM credit. So you'll be seeing those posted on our webcast webpage shortly. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account, and then there you can search for CM activities, either by the event number or the title of today's webcast, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts which are available for distance education credit, and you can check out those on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And we are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the presentation will also be available at the end of the session. Head over again to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker, and we can get started. Dr. John Renne is a managing partner of the TOD Index and the creator of the Renne-Greschner TOD Index. Dr. Renne is also an associate professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and director of the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions at Florida Atlantic University. He's an honorary research associate at Oxford University. Renne is also the managing director of the TOD Group, a real estate development, investment, and consulting firm that specializes in transit-oriented development. The TOD Group is the manager of the Denver Transit-Oriented Development Fund, which owns and is the developer of the Clear Creek Transit Village in Denver, Colorado. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just getting my presentation loaded here. And I am, just in case I have any technical difficulties, I want to apologize in advance. The internet connection I'm on, unfortunately, is not as solid as I'd like it to be, but we have contingency plans if anything should go wrong. So thank you all for tuning in. And I want to talk to you about some of the research I've been doing over the years on transit-oriented development and what it has led to, which is the Renne-Greschner TOD Index. I want to thank Eric Greschner, who's my partner, who's listening in, and Tara Tolford, who has been helping us with getting this launched. It has taken several years, and we literally just launched a website a couple days ago, so we'd love for your input to help to refine it and improve it as we kind of move forward. So the first question is, why do we need better ways to track values in rail station areas, including TODs? I say rail stations because 90% of the fixed transit stations in the United States are rail stations. It doesn't have to be rail stations. It could be ferry terminals. It could be BRT stations. So I sometimes use the word rail because it just sounds, it's easier to say than saying fixed transit station areas. But it doesn't have to be just rail. Well, but the first reason is because, first of all, transit agencies are looking for new revenue sources, and increasingly they're identifying value capture. So I recognize that maybe not everybody knows what value capture is, so I'm going to give a little background onto it. But before I do that, we're living in times of increasing austerity, both at local, state, federal levels. There was this is an article in Forbes magazine from this past April, and you could see the stats down here in this table that President Trump's budget for transit funding through Tiger and transit capital grants was $0 in his budget for 2018. Now, fortunately, I believe Congress is proposing higher levels of funding. You can see that the House is looking to appropriate $1.75 billion, but that's compared to $2.4 billion last year. So it's a significant budget cut. Even the Senate appropriations of $2.1 billion is a still a pretty significant cut from 2017, and we can probably expect that there's going to be continued pressures on funding transit in the future. Also Amtrak and other sorts of funding. So I think serious local governments, local transit agencies are seriously starting to look at transit development and value capture as a way to be able to increase their opportunities for increasing revenue streams. And some transit agencies have done well over the years, like WMATA in Washington, D.C., and some other limited transit agencies around the country. But by and large, I would say it's a relatively untapped market for increased transit. Now, it's not the magic bullet solution. I don't want anyone to get the impression that, we're going to be able to generate value capture revenues and that's going to solve all of our transit funding problems. That's not going to happen. But if we can somehow increase that as one of the viable options of funding for transit agencies, it can be part of a suite of packages that can help. So this research summarizes hundreds of studies that have been conducted, and we find through hedonic price modeling that looks at the increased value of land near train stations, that it could be really anywhere from single digits up to over 30% as you get closer to the station. The higher design amenities it is for pedestrians, mixed use, density, your premiums are going to increase higher, particularly as you get closer, and those value premiums are going to extend further away from the train station, extending, beyond the 3/4 of a mile out to about a mile. So value capture, and I suspect most of you know what value capture is, but I just want to take a moment to explain it because, not everybody, maybe people have heard of it and they don't really understand it. The chart on the left shows, your base value of land, and then, you have a planning stage here where, we start talking about, maybe we're going to open up a new light rail line. And then at some point, a decision is made to go ahead and do it, and there's a pre-construction phase. And as you do that, you have like a value capture or a value uplift in the property value that's generated because of this new infrastructure. And then once it opens, and then over time as the project proves that it is functional and has benefits to society, getting people from point A to point B and spurring development around it, the land prices go up and up. And if you look at the top right, there's a chart that shows, you have your intrinsic land value. Then a component of the value uplift is due to investments that the landowner makes. So that would be a developer building, a mixed-use building next to the train station. And these authors are arguing that private landowners should profit from their investments. Then there's an increase in value due to public investment in the infrastructure. So this would be, the new train line and the new station. And they're arguing that the public should capture a portion of this investment to help pay off the infrastructure in the first place. So they're not saying that they have to take all of it, but they're saying that the public should be entitled to some of that value uplift. And then the last component, which is not as common in the value capture literature, says that there's an increase in land value due to population and economic development. And these authors are saying that government should keep should keep this portion of the land value uplift. That's of course to be debated, but the point is that as land values increase over time, there's a way that we can capture it through a tax increment financing mechanism. And the tax increment financing mechanism is a tax. You can see here in this figure 10 here that, you've got your total assessed pre-tax increment financing valuation. And then you create your TIF district, and TIF districts usually have a set time. It could be 20 or 30 or 40 years, and that captures an increment of that increase in land value. And then what happens is it uses that increment to pay off, basically to pay off bonds or loans, to be able to, pay down a portion of the infrastructure to begin with. And then once the TIF district sunsets, then the 100% of the valuation in that district goes back to the local taxing districts that were there before the TIF district. So this could be a good win-win for developers and for municipalities that are looking to find alternative financing ways. And so if you want more information on how a lot of this works, the Transportation Research Board, I failed to mention earlier, I chair the Transportation and Land Development Committee for the Transportation Research Board. So if any of you are involved with TRB, please, get in touch and come to our meetings. We help to write a lot of problem statements that get funded through TRB, like problem statements like this, to answer real life issues and concerns for practicing professionals and give guidance on these things. And this is an example. It's a guide to value capture for financing public transportation projects, and it came out in 2016, and it's a wealth of knowledge for anyone interested in more details on this. Another reason that we may want to look at having better valuation mechanisms for understanding land value, property valuation in TOD districts is that there's a suite of new loan packages that are available in the federal government called TIFIA and RIF. TIFIA is, I forget the exact names off the top of my head, but it's through the Federal Transit Administration, and RIF is through the Federal Railroad Administration. And these programs have been around for a long time, but in the FAST Act, which was, spearheaded by former Secretary Anthony Fox, and signed into law in December of 2015, I believe. It's been about a year and a half now. And these, when the FAST Act, Locust, which is a division of developers under the banner of Smart Growth America, they really pushed hard to change the legislation in TIFIA and RIF loans to allow for smaller TOD projects. So, for example, previously you had to have a $50 million worth of infrastructure to fund for a TIFIA loan, and I don't even believe TOD was really a viable a source of proceeds under the RIF program, or if it was very difficult to get. So they rewrote that. Now you can apply for loans for projects that are, I believe, is $10 million is the minimum. And so this kind of illustrates how the TIFIA loan program works, is that you have, there's basically a series of debt payments, and there's interest payments, and RIF kind of works the same way. And you can sculpt your repayments, and there's the first 5 years where you don't have to pay any interest, or you have to pay the interest, but you don't have to pay it in those years. It just gets tacked on towards the end of the loan, and then you have the ability to sculpt your payments over the life of the loan. So it's very similar to a TIF district and value capture, but it's a loan to the federal government. Of course, there's a lot of rules that would need to be applied under federal regulations, environmental regulations, but they're trying to roll out this new program. And so these slides come from Locust, Smart Growth America. Christopher Coos, who's the managing director over at Locust, shows these are from a presentation he gave to my TRB committee. So the purpose is to fill financing gaps by private capital markets, to leverage federal funds for non-federal investment. There's some risk, and the federal government, takes some of that risk away. They provide low interest loans to all projects. There is private sector risk that still needs to be borne, and it is costed into the loan packages. But there's a lot of flexibility. For example, there's, repayment could be delayed for 5 years following construction, and then you can sculpt your loan payments to, meet the needs of the project. So one example here is Denver Union Station that used these programs actually before the FAST Act made the changes. And, it's a 20-acre redevelopment of Union Station, 1 million square feet of office, 300,000 square feet of residential, a hotel, and 100,000 square feet of commercial spaces. This project is mostly completed. It's a beautiful project if you get a chance to go to downtown Denver. This chart shows their capital stack for that project. So, they had $84 million in local funds. There was $20 million state grant. Then they had an $83 million federal grant. And then on top of that, they had $145 million worth of TIF loans and $155 million worth of RIF loans. So, you don't always have to use both TIFIA and RIF loans. You can use one or the other, but in this case, they were actually able to use both of them because of the project included. And there's certain qualifying things. So for RIF loans, for example, you need to be near it has to be intercity passenger rail or commuter rail. You can't use RIF loans for light rail or streetcars, for example. With TIFIA, you can use it for streetcars and light rail. Okay, a third reason why we want to better understand how land values are performing around rail stations is that increasingly we're seeing more private investment in both rail and TOD. So this comes from Professor Peter Newman in Australia. They put out this report called the Entrepreneur Rail Model, and they're working with the Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, to turn this into federal policy in Australia because they're very interested in using value capture and TOD as a way to pay for expanding rail infrastructure in Australia. Australia doesn't actually have the same levels of funding for transit as we do in the United States. We're very fortunate. Fortunately, we're moving towards the Australian model. The state governments do kick in a lot more funding in Australia than state governments in the United States. So the money comes from different places. But the conventional rail model is that we estimate the transit ridership numbers, right, based on models. And most of those models don't do a good job taking transit right development into consideration. And then we get financing based on these ridership estimates. And then we build the system and we see what land uses are possible based on what the private sector chooses to build. Well, they're suggesting we need to really turn this conventional model on its head. And what we need to do when we plan corridors is we need to incorporate the developers and the land use planners, and we need to see what land uses are possible based on creating corridors to maximize mixed use transit development. And then we kind of go get funding based on this, based on value capture and the packages like TIFIA, and RIF, and TIF funds. And then once we do that, then we should estimate the transit ridership numbers, because if we can show corridor A is going to have 50% more ridership because of transit development than say corridor B, then we should go after corridor A. But we need to build in these value capture and TOD mechanisms into that is basically what they're saying. And they propose, that there's, a spectrum from general tax to value capture to value creation. So on the right side where you see general tax, that's how we've been doing it in the United States for many decades. And it's really kind of a failing model, in my opinion. This is where we go out and we put a bunch of tax money into building a rail corridor, and we just fund the infrastructure, and then we kind of leave the private sector to do what they want to do to build in the development. The value capture model can be substantially public-led with some private funding, which is a lot of the conversations we've had in the United States. That is basically where the government pays for the infrastructure. They do create some mechanisms for value capture. They try to capture that to pay off some of the proceeds. But as we move to the left to the value creation, and I'm going to show you a project in a moment in Florida that is more in the value creation spectrum. It's either fully private-led or it's substantially private-led with some public assistance. And this is where the private sector is really putting in money for the rail infrastructure, and they are extracting the economic benefits of the Trans-Orient development to help pay for it. And this is the way that we did things in the United States back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I lived in New Orleans for a decade, and the St. Charles streetcar line was built that way. It was a couple of entrepreneurs who built a rail corridor, and they sold homes for wealthy homeowners that wanted to live outside of the French Quarter, and they would then sell lots, and then they would take the streetcar to downtown. Now, over the years, it switched from being private-led to the public took over the operations after it's built out. But we're kind of moving back to understanding this direction. And All Aboard Florida is the best example, or maybe the only example, of a major multi-billion-dollar investment. And this is a project that's 100% private, and you can see here, it's creating a lot of jobs. They're looking to tap into a huge travel market between Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and Orlando. The first phase of this between Miami and West Palm Beach is about to open literally any week now. So you can see here, photo was taken just the other day. I live in West Palm Beach, Florida, and this is just about a 10-minute bike ride from my house. The new train is ready to open. They've been testing it. And that building in the background includes commuter parking. It includes several hundred apartments, and it includes ground floor retail. And it's built by the same people who built the train line. All Aboard Florida. All Aboard Florida, just to give you a little backstory on them, Henry Flagler built the Florida East Coast Rail Line back in the early 1900s, and expanded it down the whole east coast of Florida to Miami, and at one point it went all the way to Key West. And so he built a train line at for example, at each of the stops at St. Augustine and Miami and West Palm Beach. The people he'd build a major hotel, and people from New York would take the train all the way down to Florida and get on this train and go to his hotel. So he made money based on this value creation model. It enabled people to go to his hotels. The corridor is still owned, by the same company that is the legacy company from Henry Flagler, and they run passenger trains on this corridor. So they looked at the market and they said, we have a huge demand from people from Miami that want to go up to Orlando, and the distances are just the right distance for rail. So they decided to make this investment and build a second track along their corridor. They're still going to continue to run the freight operations, but they're going to start running this passenger train line. At the other end of the corridor from West Palm Beach down to Miami, they're building the Miami Central Station, which is a hundreds of millions of dollars investment in a corridor that's very well served by transit. And within a 1 mile stretch of this corridor, there's $10 billion of real estate investment occurring, which is just staggering. The Miami Central Station to West Palm Beach ordinarily will take you without traffic an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes. That doesn't include the time it takes to find parking. If there's traffic, it could easily take 2.5 hours or longer. The train will reliably be 60 minutes from West Palm Beach to Miami with a stop at Fort Lauderdale, which is halfway, so it's 30 minutes to Fort Lauderdale. So one of the benefits of a project like this, and why I think the private sector is taking this leap, is because they can be car travel, and that is very essential for a lot of projects that can fall into the value creation model, is that they have the ability to build and develop the real estate at their stations, and they have the ability to create a corridor that can significantly be car travel. And increasingly, we're seeing that in some of our larger regions. So I want to kind of move into that's the background as to like the basis for why I think, you know, we need better models for looking at a lot of this stuff, because increasingly now the private sector is looking at getting into the TOD business, and they want to understand property values and home and rental values in TODs. Well, back in the, you know, around 2005 or 6, I believe, the Reconnecting America, which no longer exists, you know, they created the Center for Transit Development, which was a partnership with the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, and they launched a national TOD database, and so you can see that here, and it's still available. You can go on and download the data, which has data for 2000 and 2010. And you can see the different regions that are covered here. There's 4,400 stations across 54 regions. 90% of them are rail. I've taken this database and expanded upon it. So one of the first things I did was just looking at the basic data. I looked, working with Reed Ewing at the University of Utah, we took a look at examining transit development precincts, and looking at changes from year 2000 to year 2010. Then I worked on a project with a professor from Rutgers, David Listikin, and we looked at the National Historic Preservation Database, and we overlaid that with all these TOD stations, and we looked at the intersection between historic preservation and TOD, which is a very strong connection between the two for obvious reasons. A lot of these stations are in historic locations, and so we put together this guide to facilitate historic preservation through transit development, because in some cases there's pressure from transit development to destroy historic buildings, but we see that there's really good case studies where you can preserve historic buildings, and you can use certain tools to maybe transfer density from historic buildings to, you know, bump up the transfer development rights, for example, in other portions of the station area. I also did some work with Housing Policy Debate, which is a journal. We put a special issue together, and in that I took a look at kind of the housing and transportation costs and comparing them from transit-oriented developments to other station typologies, which I'll mention in a moment. And then also looking at transit commuting and the role of the built environment and accessibility. And I'm wrapping up a study on the last mile tensions where TODs intersect with ports. So I just want to give you a little background, and I'd be happy to chat with anybody, you know, after this or offline about any of this work. But given that, you know, this is through the Transportation Planning Division, I figured I'd give a little bit of a background into a lot of the transportation issues that I've studied through this database. Well, first of all, what I want to say is, how do I categorize station areas? So I took a look, and you know, Reed Ewing and I, you know, looked at different metrics, and I came up with this categorization that if a station area has 8 units per acre, okay, now that's gross density across the half-mile precinct. There's 500 acres within a half a mile of any point, center point of a train station, and this means that within that half-mile catchment area, there needs to be a minimum of 4,000 housing units. So while 8 units acre doesn't sound very dense, because it's a gross and not a net density, it's actually quite dense. So you know, think about the closest station that you know about, and ask yourself, are there 4,000 housing units around that station? And then we looked at an average walk score greater than 70. And for those of you not familiar with walk score, you can go to walkscore.com and get a better understanding of what a 70 would be. And you can plug in different addresses, your home, your work, where you grew up, where you're on vacation. You could take a look at the walk score to get an understanding of what a 70 is. A 70, it means it's a relatively pleasant walking environment. So when you look at every station in their database, all 4,400 train stations, we found that that about 1,400 stations were categorized as TODs. That means that they met both criteria of having the 8 units per acre and the 70 or greater walk score. Now, a hybrid station is that the station met one of these criteria, but not both. And then a transit adjacent development meant that they didn't meet either of these criteria. And you can see there's about 1,700 of those transit adjacent developments. So to kind of bring it a little bit closer, a couple examples: Pioneer Square Transit Mall in Oregon, has a gross housing density of 14.8 units per acre. It's got a walk score of 100, and it categorizes as a TOD. Bethesda, Maryland Metro Station has a gross housing density of 9.69 housing units per acre, and it has a walk score of 94, and it's categorized as a TOD. One thing I'll point out is that we went back and forth. I didn't include employment densities in these numbers, and that's because there are a lot of jobs around stations, in some cases not enough housing. But it's debatable. I would say that we've looked at doing a hybrid where you're looking at both employment and housing residential densities. So I just wanted to point that out real quick. So if it's not a TOD, then it's a hybrid or a TOD. I already explained this to you. And here's an example of a hybrid. Englewood Station in Denver, Colorado only has a gross housing density of about 2.43 acres in the database, and it's got a high walk score of 83. And Mockingbird Station in Dallas, Texas, which a lot of people know is a good example of a TOD. The inner core is quite dense, but it's a little bit lower density when you start to go out further, although they are increasing the densities. But that had a gross housing density of 3.5 units per acre and a walk score of 85. Now, it's important to note that hybrids can become TODs over time if you either increase the walk score and the housing density. So in these cases, you need to increase the housing density to get them to be a TOD. But there's other examples where maybe you have high housing density and a terrible walk score, but that's less often the case. It's usually a lack of residential density. And then here's a couple examples of a TAD. Baltimore BWI Airport Station has a 0 housing density. There's no housing at all, and it's got a 29 walk score. And in San Jose, California, the Cisco Station had 0.47 housing units per acre and a 20 walk score. So it's a transit adjacent development. And again, these can transition into TODs over time too, and that's the point, the goal. But right now they're not. So when you look at, real quick, some of the travel behavior outcomes, we see that TODs have about 57% commuting through walking, biking, and transit, compared to, for example, transit-adjacent developments are still higher than a lot of our metropolitan averages, but much lower at a 17.6% share of commuting. And then I looked at, we brought in some other data with Reed, Ewing, and Guang Tian from the University of Utah. This is based on 50,963 trips taken by 5,100 plus households across 19 regions and 136 TODs. For non-work trips, we found that in TODs, it's over 60%, and the bulk of them is walking trips, actually. So these are more walking oriented developments than they are transit oriented developments. But the transit creates the opportunity for the walking, obviously, and the work trips is even higher than the non-work trips, but still quite impressive outcomes. We looked at vehicle miles traveled per household. So in TODs, we found that the households traveled about 19 miles, vehicle miles traveled per day on average, compared to transit adjacent developments, which is double, 40. And these are all really important if you're in states like Florida, for example, where they base a lot of your if you use traffic impact fees, you're paying for traffic impact fees probably based on the 40 trips per household per day rather than the 19 that you would actually be generating if you're building a TOD. And this has become quite contentious in Florida, and I've been involved in some of these debates about trying to figure out how we can rewrite some of these regulations to better account for it. And a lot of folks don't even believe the data, honestly, but it's true. I mean, people in TODs do actually walk and take the train and bike a lot more than people that live in places where all you can do is get in your car and drive. This is some of the data I referenced earlier. I looked at how much people spend on housing and transportation, because we are finding that it's expensive to live in TODs, but you are getting a significant savings on your housing cost, on your transportation costs. So here you can see that the percent spent on housing is relatively consistent. In fact, TODs residents spend 24% of their budget on transportation, on housing, compared to TADs. And I think that's because people that live in TODs live in smaller, more efficient apartments and units, whereas in a lot of transit adjacent developments, people are living in larger single family homes. So that's why you see the 27% in the TAD housing. But the big savings is in transportation costs. TOD households spend 13% of their income on transportation compared to 22% in transit adjacent developments. And that's quite significant. And what the people are doing is they're basically in their household budget, they're able to spend more money on housing for that location, because they have that savings on the transportation side of things on their budget. One thing I want to point out before I get into the TOD index is that a lot of people say, well, what about self-selection? People who want to live in TODs are self-selecting to live there, and they're choosing that lifestyle. And I've seen a lot of research on that, and I agree with it. Yeah, I think that's the case. I think a significant percentage of the people, I don't know if it's 30 or 50 or 90% of the people, are choosing to live in TODs because they want to self-select to live in there. The problem is we don't have supply of housing in TODs nationally. The supply of housing around every train station is under 5% of the housing stock in the United States. And if you look at the National Association of Realtors that do studies nationally, the demand is about 30% of households would like to live in a TOD. Now, if you look at the millennial generation, their demand to want to live in a TOD is like double that. It's like 60 to 80%. So the issue is that, just like any product in life, if you want to give people the opportunity to have that product, but then you severely constrain the supply, what's that going to do? It's going to jack up the price, right? Because you got a lot of people competing for a very small amount of product, and they're willing to pay for it, so that's why the price goes through the roof. So we really need to start thinking about housing supply in the country and how we can increase housing. And I've actually wrote a book chapter on this in a book a few years ago called Transportation Beyond Oil. And in that book chapter, what I found is that if we increase the density of every station area in the United States without building any new station areas, if we increase the minimum density to the 8 units per acre, we could significantly increase the supply of housing where it would meet most of that demand. If we increase the density even more, like, for example, closer to the 15 units per acre, which is what you may see in, like, say, DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., or a place like that, it could pretty much account for almost all the population growth in the United States, which is, never going to happen, of course, but it's just to illustrate the point that we don't really need to build a lot of new infrastructure in the United States. I mean, it's certainly want to build new rail systems and corridors, but we don't really need to build a lot. We just need to rethink our policies and unlock a lot of the low density land around the existing stations that already exist. So the Renne-Greschner TOD Index, our goal is to help to, lead the industry to understand the value of transit development. And I've already described the methodology of how we've chosen our TODs. Again, it's the gross housing density of above 8 units per acre gross and 70 walk score. So I compare this to the national averages from Zillow, And so going back over the decades, we're able to show that the average, and we, in these charts, we're showing the zip code that exists, that the TOD exists in, which is a crude measure, but it also is surprisingly very powerful. And we also we do have data at the census tract level, and increasingly we also have access to data at the individual house level. So, you know, in the future, we're going to continue to refine this and provide more granularity. But, you know, we've just launched this a few days ago, and it's taken a while just to get to this point. So keep in mind, the data you're looking at is just the zip code, and the zip code actually understates some of the benefits of TODs because it's drawing from a larger area than, you know, just honing in right on that half-mile area. So when you look at the TOD zip codes here, we see that back in '97, you know, TOD zip codes were still significantly more than the national average. You know, they were about twice the national average. But if you look at it today, we see that TOD zip codes have surpassed $600 a square foot for the home values. And this is the Zillow Home Value Index. So we're using the Zillow estimates here because the Zillow data underlies our data. And if you look at the national home value now, you know, it's you know, $160 a square foot, $168 a square foot compared to $610 a square foot. So you can see that the rate of change has increased significantly. In fact, this next chart shows the index value. So it's increased, you know, to setting the value at 197 to the present. We see it's increased to 417. That's, you know, over 4 times the rate of growth change over that time period. And we see that the national values only increased by 225%, or you know, the value is 224.1. Now, I want you to notice something about this graph. So when you look at the graph, we see that, you know, there was the growth up till, you know, the recession, and then there was the recession. They both kind of got hit hard, although we do, some of our data shows that, you know, a lot of the TODs didn't decrease nearly as much as you know, a lot of the non-TOD locations. But Richard Florida wrote a book called The Great Reset, came out, I think, around 2010 or something like that. And what he's saying in that book is that he quotes, he says, the spigot of urban sprawl has been turned off in the Great Reset. And so this kind of shows that while that may not be 100% true, it does show that the rate of growth in the post-recession recovery period starting in January 2012 is much steeper than what we see for the national average. So I am going to be writing a paper on this saying that this is some data that shows a different set of preferences for housing in the United States post-recession versus pre-recession. And so, you know, this is reflective of kind of this new millennials and baby boomers' desires for living in walkable, transit-oriented locations. We also show the rate of growth year-over-year change. So if you look at from June 2016 to June 2017, we see the year-over-year growth in TODs was 5.8%, which actually is now starting, that growth has slowed down over the last several months. The national market is actually growing faster than TODs. You know, there's different reasons for that. You know, and I don't have a definitive answer. I think TODs have gotten so expensive that the prices are starting to slow down a little bit because it's just getting to a point where, you know, most people can't really afford TODs. So this is rental values now, and the data doesn't go back as far for the rental values. It goes back to like around 2010. But even still, we see a 49.7% growth from the end of 2010 this goes to June 2017 compared to the national market at 12%. I mean, that's a huge difference. It doesn't look as drastic as the previous slides, but it's tremendous. And on top of that, the average TOD rent, according to this is the Zillow Rent Index data, is $3 a square foot in a TOD location. I mean, think about that. That's $3,000 a month for a 1,000 square foot apartment, which is 1.6 times more than the national average, which is staggering. And this just kind of shows the index values. You know, the national market over this time period dipped and didn't get back even from November 2010 to about May 2014, and then it's been on the rise ever since. Whereas TOD values never really dipped; they just kept going straight up, and you know they continue to do so. And again, this chart here shows the year-over-year changes, and you know in the last year, growth in TOD rents were 2.2% compared to the national market of 3.1%. And June 2017 was the fifth consecutive month of positive year-over-year growth in TODs, and the second consecutive month of positive year-over-year growth in the national market. So, and then what we do is we actually have all the zip codes from the top 100 stations on the website, and you know, you could find the station name, you can look at the zip code, and you know, you can see what the rate of growth was over the last 12 months. Over time in the future, we want to provide more information about each of the station area levels, but you know, a lot of that data is available in the National TOD database, and I have a lot of updated data on that, which I don't have here in this database, but you know, certainly have the capabilities to analyze this. And then we can, you know, go into individual stations and look more specifically at records of individual properties, you know, so it's kind of a multi-layer of analysis. You know, this is really useful for regional analysis, corridor level analysis, but you know, I think if we're going to look at individual stations, we can get much better data at the stationary level, which we can do in a number of different ways. So again, what are some of the applications of this for transportation and TOD planners? Value capture modeling. You know, we're able to look at data at various geographic levels down to the individual property or the neighborhood corridor or regional modeling. We can do modeling for new loan programs, TIFIA and RIF, market analyses for TOD, public sector, private sector partnerships, private sector fully like the Bright Line. We can take a look at travel behavior modeling analysis because we have all that data. We have the ability to look at affordable housing analysis and modeling. We can guide investors on site selection, due diligence, you know, and that could be both for the private sector and for the public sector. That is looking at, you know, creating land banking funds for affordable housing. We have the ability to merge all the data in GIS with other big data sets for other types of analyses. Could be, you know, in the future, I'd like to explore public health connections, crime, school quality as examples. So that kind of wraps up the presentation of the new TOD Index. You can go to the website and take a look at it all. You can email us if you have any questions. And with that, I'm going to pass it back, and I think we'll probably have some Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you. And yes, we do. And folks, again, remember, you can type your questions in the chat box in the webcast toolbar. First question. Is it true that very high-end residential development, i.e. multi-million-dollar homes, do not see value increases near train stations? Intuition suggests the opposite might be the case for this high-end market sector.
That's a great question. I haven't analyzed that, so I can't give you a definitive answer to that. But what I'll say is it depends, I think. You know, maybe if it's a high-end single-family house, maybe it might not be as much if it's, say, a high-end loft, you know, or penthouse, you know. But I can just tell you anecdotally from my own experience that, you know, it depends on the type of service. So, for example, the Bright Line, which I mentioned, is about to open from West Palm Beach to Miami. In order to, let's say, if you wanted to buy a high-end house for, let's say your budget was $1 million, you couldn't get very much house for that, a single-family house in Miami, but you can do that. You can get a decent $1 million house that's very close to the Bright Line in West Palm Beach right now. And so if you're an attorney or, you know, somebody that, you know, is able to work and commute on the train, I can see there be an increasing appetite for now. All of a sudden, you know, you ordinarily would have to drive 2.5 hours from West Palm Beach to Miami. Now you could just buy $1 million house close to the station in West Palm Beach, and you can, you know, you'll be able to commute down to Miami and get a much bigger house for that $1 million. So I think time will ultimately, you know, we'll start looking at those things, but I can't give you any answers based on actual data at this point. I mean, there is data and studies on that topic, but it hasn't been a topic I've specifically looked at.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Given the TOD's increased land value, how much public money is typically used for the creation of a TOD, and how much of an obligation does this create for leveraging increased land value towards public services?
That is a great question, but the answer to that is impossible without knowing the specifics of every station area. That question could be the same question for any kind of a development. And, you know, if you're building a new mall by a highway interchange, you know, how much is it going to cost to build the infrastructure to put in the traffic lights and the drainage and the roads to access that new mall? It's no different with a TOD, except that TODs, you know, often tend to be more in infill locations, but these infill locations do need a lot of infrastructure funding. But it is very different in every different location. There's, you know, local considerations like groundwater flooding. If you're near a stream, there's issues like brownfield remediation. If they're former brownfield locations, there's water and sewer issues. There's transportation issues in terms of increasing the accessibility of the streets, walking and biking. I'm dealing with a lot of these issues on the TOD that we're developing in Denver at one of the new train station stops at 60th and Federal. It's called the Clear Creek Transit Village. And, you know, we've had to spend a lot of time looking at very nuanced and site-specific issues. And what I will say is that increasingly we're seeing a greater appetite from the public to work with the private sector to solve these problems. It doesn't mean that the private sector is going to pay for it all, but they seem to be willing to help solve those problems. And so that is typically, local infrastructure has typically been one of the biggest issues for seeing successful TODs implemented, because they typically have a greater cost for infrastructure to create that nice placemaking, with whether it's through landscaping or through you know, creating nice streetscapes, putting in, you know, nice sidewalks, brick streets, whatever it might be. It typically costs more to build a TOD on a per square foot basis than, you know, building your typical suburban development, where really you only are putting in minimal infrastructure to serve cars rather than people. And in that sense, I would say that TODs are disadvantaged because while the environmental impacts are less on the environment in a TOD, the cost to make that happen is much higher. So that we're, you know, increasingly needing support and tools to make that placemaking support the pedestrian scale versus the driving scale of development.
Okay, thanks. And next question, how can affordable housing be incorporated into a TOD to ensure that lower income who stand to benefit most from the access to public transit can live near planned transit hubs?
That's a great question, and I'll give you two answers. And the first answer is the most important answer, and I give it first because I think we often forget about it, and that's we need to increase the density. The more dense housing, the more housing period, the more supply of housing there is, the more competition there is on the market, and the more affordable housing there is for the market rate affordability. So, for example, if you have a station area where there's only 100 housing units next to the station, compare everything else being equal, that 100 housing units is going to be way more expensive than if you built 1,000 housing units. It's simply just because of the supply and demand issues. Okay, now let's talk about affordable housing from a government subsidized perspective. The issue with affordable housing and transportation is that they're often not coordinated. Increasingly, there are certain jurisdictions that are doing a better job at others for coordinating it. A lot of California is sort of leading the practice and trying to better coordinate affordable housing and transit development. But there's ways that transportation planners and land use and economic development planners, they need to go and talk to the affordable housing community and understand, like, what are the incentives that drive affordable housing developers. So in many states, in order to get low-income housing tax credits, you apply to the state, and the state just has a random lottery and assigning it. Other states like California, they have a point-based system, and if you're putting your project next to a train station in a TOD, you get more points for the low-income housing tax credit. So having those supportive state and municipal policies and even federal policies can go a long way to ensuring that we need to allocate the existing subsidies that we're giving to train station areas as opposed to just building affordable housing, federally subsidized affordable housing in the middle of the suburban communities where your only option is to drive. And there's other good examples at local levels where, you could also encourage more affordable housing, but that I would say, don't forget, the more density, the more supply you've got of housing near stations, ultimately over time, that supply is going to create some market affordability. Again, it may take a long time, depending on how much transit accessible housing you have, but that is the most important thing at the national scale we can do, is to figure out how to increase the supply of housing near train stations.
Great, thanks. All right, next question. To what degree will All Aboard Florida compete with TriRail in South Florida? And if you could explain those a little bit too.
Yeah, so I take TriRail every day, and it's a commuter rail service that goes from Miami to West Palm Beach, and it stops every 3 or 4 miles. The current service it goes along the I-95 corridor. There's also a proposal for TriRail Coastal Link, which will be on the same tracks as All Aboard Florida. Let's put that aside for one moment. I'll get back to it. The existing TriRail service, I don't think is going to, I don't think the Bright Line is really going to impact the existing TriRail service, because it takes 2 hours to get from Miami to West Palm Beach, but the cost is pretty affordable. It's like $9, or full ticket price is about $9 each way. Brightline's going to be a fair bit more expensive, but it's going to, rather than take you to the airport, it's going to take you to downtown Miami, so it's a different destination. It's going to be more expensive. The TriRail stops in Boca Raton and Lake Worth and Hollywood and a lot of locations that the Brightline is not going to stop, because the Brightline only going to stop in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and West Palm Beach. So I don't think the existing TriRail is going to be as competitive with the Brightline. Now the TriRail Coastal Link, which is a proposal, it doesn't exist, is proposing to use the same train tracks that the Brightline is operating on and to create a local service option. And we see this often in European countries, in Asian countries, where you have high-speed option and then you've got a local service option. And the TriRail folks are working very closely with the All Aboard Florida folks, because All Aboard Florida owns that corridor, and they're going to lease it to TriRail for this new Coastal Link service. And I think that will also be very successful when it opens, because it will serve a lot of destinations that you won't be able to get to on the Brightline. So I think that if you look again to European and Asian examples, that's kind of the direction that we're moving in Florida for this north-south service. Now, East-west transit is another question in Florida. It's a linear city because we're kind of sandwiched between the Everglades and the Atlantic Ocean, but still there's an important need to go east-west with transit, which we don't really have in Florida, other than like in Miami, and then there's kind of talks about doing something in Fort Lauderdale. But other than that, the suburbs, there's not good east-west transit. And I think that's the next frontier that we need to move into to build supportive transit to build off of the spine that we see from both TriRail and All Aboard Florida.
Thank you. Is there a correlation between the less dense TODs and building height limits? Does this track with affordability or per square foot development cost?
That's a great question, but I cannot answer it. I haven't analyzed that. It's very difficult to get national data on anything related to zoning. You'd have to pretty much collect zoning at every single train station to be able to understand what zoning allows. And as most of you who are planners know, zoning changes even around any one given station with different districts, different allowable densities. So it's a great question, something that I could speculate on, on a anecdotal basis, but I don't have any data to be able to actually answer that question from any of my national database work.
Okay. In addition to California, are there particular cities or states where TOD policies, including density bonuses, have generated significant numbers of affordable housing units?
Yeah, I believe so. I would say that Denver has done a good job with creating inclusionary housing ordinance, which applies to the whole city. It doesn't just apply to TOD locations, but it does apply to the TOD locations. It is in the city and county of Denver, not necessarily in the suburbs. But they have an ordinance that says if you build more than 30 units, then 10% of your units have to be affordable. And there's a lot of other good examples of inclusionary housing ordinances. That's an important tool that local governments can use to boost affordability. And so I would say that inclusionary housing ordinances be one of the best examples to look at for increasing the supply of affordable housing in TODs. I would say a lot of the examples that I've done, I've studied in different case studies over the years, in Chicago, for example, some in New Jersey and some in even places like Texas. There's a component of a nonprofit organization. For example, community development organization or some sort of a faith-based nonprofit organization gets involved in the real estate business and TOD business, and they create not just affordable housing, but they also create some important social services that like daycare centers and senior centers and medical centers, things like that, that typically don't get built unless you have some sort of a non-governmental organization in there as a partner. So I would say yes. I can't, rattle off, all the stations, on the top of my head, but I'd be happy to, give some more examples. I did a study for the TRB on it was called Legal Research Digest 36, so you can look that one up. And that looked at transit, joint development, case studies. We looked at 5 case studies. Oh, Portland, Oregon is a great example, what they've done in the Pearl District. There's a lot of affordable housing there, but then there's a lot of expensive housing. There's not a lot of middle housing. They call it the missing middle. We're seeing that some of the problems isn't necessarily affordable housing, it's kind of that missing middle, which is the market rate affordable housing. And, that's where I'm saying we need to increase densities to be able to, and expand the networks to be able to get more of that middle income housing.
Okay, thanks. Next question. We tend to see that the type of residential uses that want to locate near transit stations are rental apartments. Despite the proposed rental being a high-end product, we have received some pushback on several occasions from local municipalities who want to see a condo ownership type of product. Have you seen the same? What approaches have been successful in getting over this perception hurdle related to rental?
I have seen a little bit of that. Not as much on the pushback per se on rental versus condo, but just more in general based on pushback for the density. But I've seen a little bit of the pushback. And, in the markets that I'm closest to, like in Denver, for example, there is no condo construction because there's statewide building defects laws that have inhibited condo construction. So in Denver, for example, there's a huge push from the development community to try and change state laws to get more condo construction, period. But they're using TOD as an important way to say we need to create more ownership opportunities in TODs, and we need to look at these building defects laws. But let's say other markets where you have no issues building condos. I honestly haven't seen as much pushback against the rental. Just in general to the pushback against the density. And what I'm thinking of in particular is a case going on in Boca Raton, Florida right now, where a developer wants to build a quite dense product, mix of rental and condo, but there's just more fighting over the traffic impacts that it's going to generate. To the example that you raised about rental, I would say, the best developer in South Florida, a guy named Gandir Salor, who runs what's called Cypress, Florida, has built a bunch of multifamily developments, and he gave a presentation to the Boca Raton City Council about 2 months ago, and he showed the City Council, look, in rental buildings nowadays, the finishes are no different than in condos. They include granite countertops, they include, decent appliances, and that's because that's the market. These people want nice amenities, and really from a construction cost perspective, there's really no difference nowadays between rental and condo, at least in that market in South Florida. So I thought that was very effective because there was some concerns about rental, but he, I think, did a good job using examples. It wasn't just talking about the set. He showed real examples of projects that he built that are rental and the high quality of finishes. And he actually gave a city council planning commissioner a tour of one of the recent buildings that he completed that is a rental building in West Palm Beach, and the guy was just blown away at how nice it was. So those might be some tools that you could use if you're getting pushback, is to find the good examples, the new projects that have been built. They don't have to be TOD locations. They could be new rentals that are built anywhere to a high standard, and you take folks on a tour of those buildings to see the high quality that they are.
Okay. The data suggests that TOD projects should especially provide a set aside percentage of multifamily residential units for moderate income individuals or families. Otherwise, the higher value units and likewise higher income occupants will cause TOD projects to become exclusionary. Is this true?
I do think that the prices are indicating that there's increasing exclusion based on price. And again, that's why I was highly saying it's encouraging that the most important thing we can do is to increase the supply of housing around stations. Again, less than 5% of housing units nationally are within one of these 4,400 station locations around the country. And that includes everything in Manhattan, everything in Chicago, everything in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, Charlotte, Miami, Houston, everywhere, right? But less than 5% of housing units are within a half a mile of any passenger station, whether it's BRT, ferry, or any type of rail in the United States. The demand is arguably, between 30 to 50%. So you're going to have, that mismatch between supply and demand, which drives price up. I don't think there's a government program in the world that's going to fix that problem. And I think that, I take that back. There is one government program that can fix that problem. but we're probably not going to touch it, and that's the mortgage interest deduction, right? If we said that you only get the mortgage interest deduction if you buy a housing unit in a TOD location, otherwise you don't get it, then that would drive a huge boom to build new housing around train station areas. And it sounds pretty crazy to think that that could be a policy, but I've heard some policy folks in DC talk about policies like that, because we give a huge subsidy for the mortgage interest deduction. And should we just be subsidizing sprawl and people, buying homes in places where they have a huge cost to society because of the high levels of carbon dioxide they create and all the other issues. Now, in reality, I don't think it's going to change. But there's other tools I think we can use to increase the supply, and I think that's what we need to focus on nationally and at the local and regional levels, is what can we do to increase the supply of housing stock near train station locations. And one of the biggest issues is, people don't want to see density. They don't want to see tall buildings. But we do need some height. It doesn't have to be, 30-story buildings, but, you need to be able, you could build pretty dense housing, with, 5 to 10-story buildings. And the more zoning successes that we can get to allow for 5 and 10-story buildings around station locations, I think the more we'll be able to see the private market go in and build new product. But I think it could potentially take 10 or 20 years to even address that supply and demand issue.
Okay, thanks. Are you aware of any use of linkage fees paid by non-residential TOD developments to subsidize affordable residential developments within the TOD?
I'm not aware of what a linkage fee is, so I'd have to say I can't answer that question.
Okay. I think that's it for our questions right now. So I guess we're gonna.
I can try it. I can take a crack at that question theoretically.
Sure.
So, are people using affordable? Are they using market rate housing to subsidize affordable housing? I'd say, yeah, that's exactly what an inclusionary housing ordinance does.
Okay. And that must have answered the question. I didn't see anyone else type anything in further about that. So that's it. I think we're done. I think we're going to wrap up a little early today. So John Renne, thank you for joining us today, and for the Transportation Planning Division for sponsoring today's webcast. And a PDF of the presentation will be available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and we will get a recording of this session up on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. So John, thanks again, and everyone have a great weekend.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.